I'm pretty sure that most of you know that if you get yourself a low aperture f1.2 lens, you will have nice blur background. But this is the only way? You know that aperture is only one of the parameters that affect depth of field and is responsible for the blur. But first thing first, what is depth of field? I don't know who came up with this scientific description that always confuses people at first, but to simplify it, depth of field is just an area of sharpness in a photograph. When you're focusing on your subject, you will have part of the image in focus and other parts out of focus. Your camera can only perfectly focus on one exact point of this depth, and that point is your focal plane. Your camera can only perfectly focus on one exact point of depth. This is your focal plane. However, the area immediately in front of it and behind that focal plane also looks acceptably sharp. So this entire slice of sharpness is called depth of field. And that area of sharpness have a limit. It has a near limit and it has a far limit. The near limit is how far it extends in front of the area of focus, and the far limit is how far it extends behind it. So when you hear shallow depth of field, it means the area of sharpness is very small, tiny one, with very little sharpness before and behind the subject in focus. And when you hear a large depth of field, it means that the area of sharpness is very large. And the near and far limits extend well in front and behind of the subject. For example, portrait photographers will often use shallow depth of field. The general approach in portraiture is to have the person in focus and their surrounding blurred. That gives more attention to the object that you're photographing, the person. Landscape photographers usually try to have a very large depth of field so they can have the whole scene sharp. So you can see that different photographers have different needs and different usage of that depth of field. So to create photographs with a blurry background, we need to understand what affects that area of sharpness and how we can maximize background blur in our photographs. Now, before getting into technical aspects, let's look at a few photographs and see the difference in real life. This is large depth of field and this is shallow depth of field. This is large depth of field again, and this is shallow depth of field again. Alright, I hope this is clear. So how do we create that background blur? Background blur is created mainly by four things. The first one is your lens aperture. This is actually the one that everyone kind of knows. Especially if you started your photography journey with a kit lens that doesn't go below f3.5, you probably remember the excitement of getting your first 50mm f1.8 lens and how much it was a game changer. So yes, a lens with lower aperture will give you shallow depth of field, which will result in this beautiful blurred background. But when you're buying a lens, there is one more factor to consider, and it is the lens focal length. Depth of field changes drastically between different focal lengths. For example, a 28mm at f2.8 will have significantly larger depth of field and less blurred background than a 135mm lens at f2.8. The rule of thumb is, the wider your lens is, the larger the depth of field is, and the less background blur will be in your photograph. So wide lens, no background blur; tight lens, telephoto lens will have usually more. And there are a few lenses that are legendary for their ability to blur the background. These are the 85mm f1.2, 135mm f1.8, and the 200mm f2. If you start looking at price tags, you will quickly find that they range somewhere between $2,000 to $6,000. So having a very large aperture is very expensive. And now you know why. It's because these lenses are some of the best for achieving this beautiful blurred background and allowing more light to touch the sensor, but we're not speaking about light this time. But there is more to it. You don't necessarily need the most expensive lenses to get that background blur. There are two other elements that affect background blur that we haven't spoken about yet. And one is your camera sensor. The larger your camera sensor is, the shallower your depth of field will be. For example, an 85mm lens with f1.8 aperture on a full frame sensor will have a smaller area of sharpness than exactly the same lens on an APS-C cropped sensor. And if you take your phone with its pinky nail side sensor, your phone cannot blur the background optically at all. So it uses all kinds of software to emulate that blur, portrait mode, for example. And there's an optical formula that calculates all these things. For most photographers, memorizing the formulas isn't necessary. Instead, it is important to understand the relationship between these variables. There are online depth of field calculators and smartphone apps will all do the heavy lifting for you. I have linked a calculator in the video description so you can check it in there. So the way it looks now, it's that if you don't have a full frame camera with a low aperture telephoto lens, you can't really get these nice blurred backgrounds, right? Well, no. I'm happy to say that there is a fourth parameter, and that parameter doesn't require you to spend anything on gear, but you can still use it to maximize your blurring effect. And the name of this parameter is distance. And somehow I found that a lot of you don't have clear understanding on how distance affects depth of field and background blur. It doesn't matter which camera and lens combination you use, the distance to your subjects also impacts that area of sharpness size. The optics work in such a way that the closer you are to your subject, the smaller that area of sharpness gets, and the more background blur you get. So yes, you can capture decent portraits with blurred backgrounds using a lens like 24-70 f4. If you put the lens at f4, zoom in to 70mm and get close enough. It wouldn't match the expensive lenses results, but with the proper lighting you can create very comparing results, something that will still look very, very good. And here are some tips of how to get the maximum out of your lens, whatever it is. If you don't have an expensive lens, just use distance to your advantage. Open your aperture as much as your lens allows, zoom in as much as you can, and get closer to your subject. If you try that, I'm sure that you will manage to get some good results. Another thing to pay attention to is the background. Yes, we are blurring most of it, but we still need to pay attention to elements that will be visible even blurred. Some shapes, forms, light and colors can still have a dominant presence. So if you see these taking over and competing with your subject, try to reframe or move the subject closer to you and further away from these distracting elements. And while we are on the background subject, remember, even shallow depth of field can often have some details before and after your subject. For example, if your subject is standing right next to a brick wall, it is very likely that the bricks and their texture and their lines won't be blurred completely and still drawing some unnecessary attention. You can easily solve this by moving your subject a little bit forward from the wall. And guys, this is a very common mistake that I see a lot of working photographers, even professional, making. They take someone on a photo shoot and photograph him in front of a graffiti. They put the person just next to the graffiti wall, thinking that this would be a very nice background for their subjects. They take the photographs, and then when you're looking at it, you see that graffiti taking over. It becomes very prominent and competes with your subject. So the way to deal with it is simply take the subject that you photograph 1-2 meters, 3 to 6 feet away from the wall, and that will weaken that graffiti. Because sometimes if the person is just near the graffiti, and make it background rather than a competing element. So play with the distance. It's a very important parameter that photographers often ignore. Depth of field is not only about the gear, distance. It has a lot of impact and importance when you're trying to achieve these blurred backgrounds. And did you know that using depth of field isn't the only way of introducing blurry backgrounds? We can use slow shutter speed techniques called panning. There is a more detailed video about slow shutter speed techniques somewhere here, and I will also link it in the description below. Aesthetically, background blur is pleasing to the eye. We don't normally experience such an effect in our everyday vision. And if I extend my hand in front of me, everything behind it will kind of get blurry. But I don't actually see that blur. I see only the object I'm looking at, my hand in this case. So when you first see photographs with that smooth, blurred, beautiful background, you love them. They look very special, professional, and interesting to look at. And as a new photographer, you should definitely learn how to photograph this way. But don't stay there. Because technically and compositionally, background blur helps in highlighting and separating your subject by weakening the background elements and the surrounding in general. That gives you the feeling that you are creating nice, clean images with beautiful composition, but the truth is the opposite. You're barely touching composition working that way. I have another video called Composition Starts at f11. I recommend that video to every photographer. It's often a wake-up call to many who are tied strongly to photographing with low apertures and shallow depth of field. I will list that video in the description as well. And I hope this video was helpful for you. And if you have any questions, write them down below in the comments. See you next time and happy shooting!